it's been such a great programme over these last couple of days. I've certainly learnt a huge amount, and I'm pretty jealous. I think we need an ANZSOG for the UK. At least we just don't have something like that. I'm not quite sure why. This question of the relationship between austerity and public service reform, there's clearly been a relationship in the UK, but I think it's quite a complicated one. I think that I'm a sort of glass is 2/3 full kind of guy. So there's certainly, you can see how the economic situation, the financial situation has driven reforms, and some really interesting reforms. I'm going to touch on those today. But I've also witnessed examples where good quality public servants have just faced with a pace and a scale of change, haven't managed to make this sort of systemic reforms, and actually have gone for more simple, straightforward cuts to services instead of doing the sort of the more fundamental change. So I do think there's a complicated relationship there. It's no surprise that the recession's had an impact on public services in the UK. We were forecast to have the highest deficit in the G20 at one point, and as we were dealing with the repercussions of this, we had a new elected government in 2010, which was unusually a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. They made a priority to tackle the structural deficit in the UK, and to do that via spending cuts. And whilst we're starting to see the first signs of, we hope, economic growth returning, the impact of cuts on public services is one that's going to continue for certainly the foreseeable future. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the change on public services, the view of public services has changed. And I think one of the big shifts has been something that I've tried to capture in this slide, and it's not part of a public narrative. This isn't sort of a way in which I think much of the UK would recognise, even within government in a way. But I think is these sort of three tiers of how we're approaching public services, I think is particularly clear within the Cabinet Office where I work, but I think has got a broader relevance. It came from something which was more of a public narrative as the government came in, talking about, in their view, how the previous government had held tight things that should have been let loose, and held loose things that should have been kept tight, and they've consciously tried to flip that arrangement. And now, what do I mean? The view of ministers coming in was that we needed a much stronger corporate centre within the government. Those areas such as HR, procurement, estates management, IT, things that in the UK across public services had not been glamorous roles, and perhaps had not had as much corporate attention, yet clearly controlled a huge amount of the finances of the British state. And so what we've seen is a much stronger centralisation of some of those services, a stronger professionalisation of the people working within that. In the middle tier, on more broader public service reform, we've seen a strong drive towards a greater diversity of providers in public services, stronger accountability. It's a lower tier, and in some ways a move away from the sense of the centre having a monopoly on public service provision. Now, I think there's, particularly if I was giving this talk, say, 4 years ago, there's been a really distinct shift in the UK about the amount of central grip of that process. So clearly, there's a very clear policy framework as these things go, but actually the responsibility on the public service reform has been devolved down to individual departments and actually out to the local government and elsewhere. And it's much less centrally driven than it has been previously. I still think that's probably in stark contrast to countries like Finland and elsewhere, where there's a much more decentralised system. But in the UK over recent years and decades, that centralised grip and control, there has been a shift there. And I think that shift is interesting and significant. And then this kind of this new focus on this sort of outer tier, particularly with a strong prime ministerial interest in this. And it's really what the sense that actually the space of public services is wider than the sense of the state, and that it's not going to be more government that's going to help us deal with some of the trickiest areas of need in future years. So particularly that space between government and the private sector, government and the voluntary sector, and even just the role of private individuals in a civic space, and that contribution towards what you could say is a public realm of civic innovation, of even public services in some degrees, is I think a really, again, a distinct shift from where we have been in previous years. And the group that I lead with my colleague Helen Stevenson is around this government innovation group, which is around this sort of space of civic innovation, but it does cross into those other areas too. So I'm just going to go through some of those three tiers, and it's starting with that sense of central grip, the newly formed efficiency and reform group within the Cabinet Office. I say as both centralised but also professionalised, bringing in a large amount of external talent from outside to be able to do some of these traditionally seen as less glamorous services in a much more just a stronger way, really, and it's had a really distinct impact in terms of the amount of money saved, but also in how we deal with some of these services. I'm not going to go through these, though we can pick up more if you want to afterwards in the session. But I would say, an example that I think is quite pertinent is the government digital service that has been brought in. And what they've done is change the nature of how we procure for IT really, really radically. So instead of that sense of the big IT contracts with a small number of massive IT providers, they've developed a different process where they've managed to bring together digital services in a way that's enabled the smaller startups, the SMEs, to be able to truly bid and win work within the government. And we've seen really great innovation in that space. Patrick Dunleavy this morning was talking more about the importance of having services that are truly digital by default and natively digital, and that's starting to happen in the UK via the government digital service, bringing in agile with a capital A ways of working into government, which is bringing a new sense of what it means to be providing these public services. I do think it's a very significant change. We can talk about it in more length. They've also won a very prestigious design award for gov.uk, the new sort of website for the UK government, which is just much clearer, much more simple to navigate, and puts a huge premium on the user experience. On the public services, the origins of many of these innovations, I think you can trace back a number of years to perhaps the Blair era or even before. So you've had a strong focus on payment by results in employment services, and also now in probation at a pace and a scale that we haven't seen before. You've had things like a major transformation in education with schools leaving local authority control to be independent organisations, new free schools set up by teachers or parents. And as I say, a real sort of change and move away from this, what the new ministers, I mentioned it earlier in the question, that new ministers had called this deliverology, the sense that people like me at the centre would be sort of designing grand designs and plans, and that they'd be sort of handed over and then delivered, and everyone would sort of pull these levers of reform to check what was happening all the way down a delivery chain. And they saw that as essentially a process that had been damaging to public services because it had a myth of control from the centre, and they've moved to a much more distributed sense of reform, underpinned by this framework. And of course, subject to all the normal focused and political control and official control you'd expect in the system, but with a distinct shift from where we were previously. I'm going to talk a little bit more about, in the time that I have, about the Government Innovation Group and that space at the sort of outer tier of what I talked about. there's something here about the not just the nature of these services, but let's see if did I include that slide? Yes, about what we do and how we work. Say a really strong move away from the idea of developing grand plans at the centre, and instead much more of a focus on a sort of civil service entrepreneurship in a way. So working with those reformers out and about in frontline services, trying out new ideas, if you like, failing quickly and learning and adapting those changes at a relatively small scale, learning and building those programs. So some of the things that we try out, we adapt and amend quite quickly. Other things we've not pursued with the same vigor, but we're starting to see, you've come across the guys from the Behavioural Insights team, of which we sort of have an association with, but in other areas like social impact bonds and elsewhere, a real sort of, we're making new markets. We're bringing in that expertise and interest from outside the public sector, new ways of working, being alert to the outside world, and it just feels a really healthy way of bringing in change within the public services. Having been in those strategy units where, yes, they're responsible for some major reforms over the last decade or so. But many of the programs and, let's say, the grand plans didn't come to anything like the same level of fruition in practical reality as they might have done. And some of that, I think, is down to the process and the transmission of innovation and how we work. I'm just going to, in the time that I have, give you a sense of what does all that actually mean, right? I think that a big part of the government innovation group and the side that's more generally led by my colleague Helen is around the charitable sector and the voluntary sector, and really thinking about those in a different way. I don't mean here the contracting for particular services within the normal public sector realm. That's not what we mean here. What we mean is trying to find that space where there's a mutual interest between the voluntary sector, between civic activity and the government's interest. And one example here is about the Dementia Friends example that I've got up on the board. The idea here is that you've got the Alzheimer's Society, an independent charity, running a campaign with government, partly funded by government, and with prime ministerial and with senior official influence and scope given to it, where what the idea is you're bringing together a network of 1 million citizens, not formal volunteers, not paid for volunteers by the state or contracted by the state, but 1 million people who we aim to make dementia friends, right? So the idea is that if you're at the supermarket till and there's somebody struggling with their PIN code or dealing with the till, there'll be this network of people who understand what is going on, who know how to be able to help in that situation, and that who at meetings where they come together are making pledges about the sort of help and activity that they might be able to give people with dementia in their local communities. These supported by a set of champions who are properly trained through the Alzheimer's Society, and again supported by the team in the Government Innovation Group. So it's reaching out to try and encourage, facilitate some of that action within civic society, not within the normal voluntary sector and not within the contracted arrangements of public service, but to try and reach out in a sort of different space. And this is one example of many different arrangements that we have. A similar area within the partnerships, business partnerships team within the group is that space between government and the private sector. And again, many of those larger organisations having corporate social responsibility sections and interests, and again trying to find the space between government's interest and the interests of the private sector, and being able to leverage some of that help and support beyond the normal realm of the state. This example is from a trial being run by the Department for Education, again supported with the partnerships team in the Cabinet Office, where the idea is to be able to create a market in parenting classes. So there's 3 areas of the country where you can get hold of parenting vouchers to be able to go to classes and help and support parents of with different needs. Now, the idea is instead of these being delivered by the state or through state institutions, the vouchers, the aim is to try to make it as unstigmatized as possible and be able to encourage people to be able to apply of all different sort of social types and backgrounds, but without that sense of stigma of you being sent on a government parenting class. And so teaming up with one of the large large pharmacy companies in the UK, Boots, in these areas of the trial, they've got their staff who have these leaflets, and depending on what parents, what their customers buy, they say, well, have you seen these parenting vouchers? Have you thought of doing something like that and taking advantage of that? In other areas in the trial, these leaflets are just available on the till. So, some of this is, relatively smaller scale stuff, but I think is quite interesting in terms of the realm of innovation within government and stretching that space of normal government activity out to that realm in between government and these different sectors. I know we've had a session on this already in the last couple of days on social impact bonds. So I won't go into that at length, but we have a team focused on social finance within the Government Innovation Group. And their role is essentially to make a new market based on philanthropic investment and social finance to be able to support public services. So in the mutual session yesterday, I touched upon the need for those mutuals to be able to have access to working capital, and the social finance team play a strong role there. But there's also this development of the social impact bonds and those sort of contracting arrangements. And the idea is behind this, for some of you, I know about this already, but the idea is you have external social financial investors who provide working capital to external contractors, often social enterprises or charities, providing an early prevention service very frequently. The idea is with that additional preventative service, you avoid future acute costs to the state. And at that point where those costs are released, then the government pays that on a payment by results basis. So the idea being that, common conundrums like, we spend a lot on HIP operations, but we find it difficult somehow to be able to transfer the funds between different government agencies to be able to do the amount of prevention work that we know would reduce those operations in time. You can bring in this additional social finance to be able to deal with that essentially sort of market failure or government failure, if you like, of being able to spread the resources over time and across different agencies. We've had the first example in Peterborough was mentioned earlier, but now we've got a much larger number of social impact bonds underway and across the UK and in different services. So I should explain. So NEETs are children not in education, employment or training. So sorry, jargon sort of crept in there. But often on children on the edge of social care is a good example. So children that we know we'd expect to cost a huge amount of money, and also the consequences on them and their lives and their families' lives of being brought into care. We still find it hard to be able to intervene at those points beforehand that we know we know and suspect may have a good chance of reducing those costs in the future. The idea is we're also bringing in different forms of service provision, more innovation as a result, and also some of the watching eye of social investors within that arrangement, be able to have an eye over what those new providers are doing in a way that normal contracting arrangements often don't do. And the last example that I'm just going to pull up within the Government Innovation Group is what we've been doing on open data. And I just think there's a huge potential in this space. So, we mentioned just now that we see this as a driver not just of public service reform, but also accountability of the state back to taxpayers, but also as a form of new economic growth. With an emerging tech sector in the UK, we unashamedly want one of the next new generation of tech companies to be a UK-based company. And the open data that we release from government, we make it available without restrictive licenses, nearly always free and machine readable for the computers. Has a role to play within that, alongside all those other things like, the Internet of Things, big data, and all the rest. So it's one element of that data and tech revolution that is already, as we know, changing our lives. We've got the machines in our pockets that would have amazed us 10 years ago or more. We have data.gov.uk as the portal into this data. So we've really now quite large amounts of data sets there. That people outside of government are using. So these can be a mixture of big tech and data businesses that you'll be, household names that you're aware of, many small startup companies based in tech hubs around the country, but also from transparency campaigners and others interested in what happens with the government pound. These are, I've not included lots of examples, but just some here are used in different ways. So you've got at the back up here, the stuff from The Guardian, data blog, data-derived journalism, data journalists working in the UK and internationally nowadays, pulling together the data from data.gov.uk, be able to show citizens where the money is spent and what the impact, in this example, the impact of cuts has fallen. Some really interesting examples out there, not just The Guardian, but elsewhere, of people taking the data that we have, being able to display it in a visually attractive way, but also be able to use it as a form of pressure against government, against different service providers, about what's happening and why it's happening. I think as we see this working internationally through, we've worked on, through the UK presidency of the G8, we worked on and brought in the G8 Open Data Charter. We're also, this year, the lead co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, this sort of collection of 60 countries who have, many of the reformers in those countries coming together on a journey to become more open, regardless of where you're starting from. And you're seeing this sort of transformational impact on democracy, essentially, in a modern environment. Whether you're, say our co-chairs are in Indonesia, it's remarkable how similar some of these processes can be in a place like Indonesia with, I guess, the fourth largest Facebook nation on earth, huge amounts of penetration of mobile technology and a young population too. These other examples we're starting to see here is, it seems like half of London or more has sitting on their smartphone an application that will tell them, exactly when the next bus is arriving, the next tube, the next train, where the next parking space is. And these things, there's a plethora of these different applications, not done by the state, made by private companies and individuals. And there are some of the areas where we found companies have found it easiest to commercialize some of this activity. Even to the extent that Sound Transport for London, their data they make available in an open format, it's processed and dealt with by a private company and then essentially sold back to Transport for London in their application, but also on with other applications too. So we're starting to see a more sophisticated market arriving there, and it's not just in London, I should say, in other cities too. But the other, I think there's interesting promise on the other side. So, in some ways, your bus is late, your bus isn't late. It's a pretty binary service. What we're starting to see is open data starting to have an impact on other more complex public services. So in this case, this is work from an interesting startup being incubated by the Open Data Institute in London called Mastodon C, working on the millions and millions of lines of prescribing data from primary care providers across the UK over the last decade or so. And what they looked at in this example was where people had used branded statin drugs as opposed to generic statin drugs. So exactly the same drug, but some GPs were using the sort of big pharma's version rather than the generic version. And in that difference, essentially, this is a Pareto improvement, right? Without changing anything, there was £200 million worth of difference between, if all those GPs started to use the generic drugs rather than the branded drugs. So it's one thing having the analytics and another thing making the change happen as a result of that. We're quite aware of that. But these guys, using the big data techniques, are able to dig into the data in a way that we found difficult to do before and present it publicly in a way that is more likely to, we think, to generate the pressure to bring about some of the change there. I do think there's some really interesting promises. We're talking about public service reform, particularly for those services where there's an element of direct consumer choice, or even a sort of a broader general citizen voice, if you like, to be able to bring in the power of the data in your pocket, to be able to start to challenge the views of the professions, the views of the state, and be able to help prompt and provoke some of those changes, whether that's in the quality of the schools and the education that you're having, about the level of service that you experience when you go along to your GP or elsewhere, as we're moving towards more personalisation in people's social care, the ability to have an analysis of what is possible, what other people are doing in the way that we normally expect and see in our private lives through commercial companies. And obviously there's big differences between the world of commerce and public services, goes without saying. But to start to use open data within that realm, I think, is really quite a significant move, and something that we're quite proud of the work that's been going on in the UK. So that's where I'm going to leave that. I say for me the big takeaway points are the extent to which the view of public services has changed over the last few years. No doubt, partly driven by austerity and the financial crisis, but not only about it. Some of this is clearly about just a shift in government and a change in philosophy around public services that we've had in that change of government. I think we see a much stronger focus on the corporate centre and the need to do that in order to save money and to professionalise those services that perhaps have been neglected in previous years. We're seeing a big shift around in public service reform, some really big changes happening around a diversity of provision, but also a loosening of the controls around where that reform is happening. Certainly compared to what we saw in previous years. And the bit that I'm responsible for on the Government Innovation Group, of that trying to activate some of those spaces outside of the normal government realm. So certainly bringing in new ideas from outside, but also trying to activate that space between government, government and the private sector, government and the voluntary sector, and trying to prompt and activate that space outside, I think is some really interesting stuff going on in the UK, and it's great to have the opportunity to be able to both talk to you about it, but also hear the good work that's been going on here and elsewhere, and the examples that we've had. Okay, thank you.